welcome back. Now it's kind of getting serious, my top 30 favorite albums of all time, and without much further ado, number 30 is Rye Ay by Dexys Midnight Runners. I think it's the best album. I know some people would say the first album is maybe better, but this is the pure 80s pop ecstasy, euphoric, feel-good album. This is really a start to finish, very danceable, very sing-along kind of album. You know, it's like a pop sing-along put to perfect 80s production. You know, they had the same production team as Madness, and it, you know, it sounds a lot like them. It's some of the best songs. I mean, the Celtic Soul Brothers, Let's Make This Precious, the cover of Van Morrison's Jackie Wilson Set, and of course Come On Aline. This is one of those songs that are iconic and maybe very overplayed and even like a meme nowadays, but I still don't get tired of. You know, this is a song I can listen to like 10 times a day if I would like to, and it never gets old. And also the so-called album tracks, fantastic. You know, Plan B, I'll Show You. It's like a medley of the songs Plan B, I'll Show You. It's probably my favorite Dexys Midnight Runners moment, and I like basically everything they did. They didn't do that much in quantity, but everything they did I like. Even the more difficult album they did, what's it called, Don't Stand Me Down or something like that. I even like that, which is very different sounding. But this is the finest hour in my opinion. This is a perfect pop album. Number 29, again a bit controversial, getting a bit controversial here. It's Goat's Head Soup by the Rolling Stones. It's often, you know, the classic Mick Taylor phase, the golden era of the Stones. It's often 4 albums. You know, the people often talk about the iconic 4-album run of Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. But what about the album they did after Exile on Main Street? You know, it's at least a 5-album run for me, and this is one of the best albums of this run and in general of the Rolling Stones. I personally prefer it to Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, and even Sticky Fingers, and it's one of my all-time favorite Stones albums, and therefore it's also one of the most underrated Stones albums. I don't get it why people make this cut after Exile on Main Street and say, you know, after that they kind of, you know, went bland or lost something. This is still in the middle of the Mick Taylor years, so this is probably, next to It's Only Rock and Roll, Mick Taylor's strongest contribution to the Stones. But it's also Mick and Keith on top form. Angie, which was written by Keith, is a fantastic ballad, maybe the best ballad ever. But also the rocking songs are fantastic on this album. And a song like Winter, this is my personal favorite on this album is Winter, like a deep cut. This is the Stones sounding a bit like Van Morrison, and as you can tell from my top 100 favorite albums of all time, I'm a big fan of what Van Morrison did, especially around that time. And yeah, this is just a fantastic album, and this is one of those cases, don't believe the critics. If you like the Stones and you maybe only have a best of, or maybe 1 or 2 of the more iconic albums, and the critics kind of scare you off from digging out this, I disagree. I would say this is essential. If you only have 3 or 4, or let's say 5 Stones albums in your collection, this should be one of those 5. My number 28 is Help by the Beatles. Last episode we had Abbey Road, and some Beatle fans will be shocked that I prefer Help to Abbey Road. But it's the opposite thing with Goat's Head Soup, where I think the golden phase, that critics for some strange reason think that after Exile on Main Street the golden phase was over, and I argue that Goat's Head Soup is still, you know, prolongs that golden phase. And with the Beatles, people say the golden phase starts with Rubber Soul, you know, where they really became artists and so on, you know, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, all that stuff. Again, I disagree. I would say this is the start of them. I think that Beatles for Sale, you know, people sometimes say this is the transitional record from the early Beatles to the, you know, grown up psychedelic Beatles. I think Beatles for Sale is that transitional record and therefore also a very underrated album. But nowadays even more underrated than Beatles for Sale is Help, that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, that album. But let's just talk about the most iconic songs of this album. By virtually any other band or act in rock history to have those 5 songs I'm going to tell you about now on an album, that would justify this album being called one of the best albums of all time. This album has Help, this album has You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, this album has Yesterday, this album has Ticket to Ride, this album has I've Just Seen a Face, and album tracks that you're going to lose that girl. It's a fantastic album. And I think if they had left off the 2 covers, Act Naturally and what's the other, Act Naturally and Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and just release it as a 12-track album, I think the common consensus would be that this is already the start of this Rubber Soul Revolver phase, and this is on a par with Rubber Soul and Revolver. So, but still it has the energy of the early Beatles, which is also great. So this is one of the albums that has, again, the best of both worlds in a way. Still the fresh, sing-along, catchy early Beatles, the Mop Tops, but also more than hinting in the more serious, artistic direction. So Help, maybe the most underrated Beatles album these days. Maybe one of the more underrated Kate Bush albums these days is the Sensual World from I think 1989. The problem this album faced was that it had to follow up Hounds of Love, and Hounds of Love came out like 4 or 5 years before, so there was lots of expectations building up and up. This was the start of Kate Bush taking things slower, in the first 10 years of her career. She had a regular schedule of releasing albums, but that was the start of the Kate Bush, as we see Kate Bush today, as an artist who takes very, very long to record new albums. And this kind of, this album wasn't seen as the big masterpiece because it came out so many years after Hounds of Love as the follow-up, and Hounds of Love is of course, this big iconic statement of an album. But this is maybe a small statement of an album, but nonetheless a very rewarding, beautiful statement. This is more inwards looking. The title says it all, the sensual world. This is about the sensual world in a way, and it's fantastic. It's a bit more somber, a bit more autumnal. Hounds of Love it's more like a summer energy to me. This is more like autumn. And it's a wonderful album to listen to in like October, November, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, of course. Sensual World, very underrated Kate Bush album, if there's such a thing as an underrated Kate Bush album, of course. The next album is like the mother of all initially underrated or undervalued albums, but this is, of course, the album that, if there's one album that had redeemed itself the most in rock history, it's probably Ram by Paul and Linda McCartney, my favorite Paul McCartney solo album. It's, I'm not going to repeat the story. Every Beatles fan or Beatles solo fan knows the story. But when this came out, Rolling Stone destroyed this album, and all the other journalists back in the day, they kind of copied their opinion from the iconic Rolling Stone opinion. Jan Wenner, didn't like Paul McCartney back then, and was like was mates with John Lennon, and this was of course the time 1971 when John and Paul were feuding. So Jan Wenner, just didn't pay attention to the artistic value of this album. He just wanted to destroy Paul because he wanted to hail John Lennon. That was really one of the most, at least if you're a Paul McCartney fan, one of the shittiest things ever done to an iconic artist and album. This is Paul McCartney's masterpiece, make no mistake. And in recent years, it's finally, it got its recognition, and it's now estimated, rightfully so, as one of the best. Especially the indie generation, indie music, indie alternative fans. They really, they re-listened to this album. I was one of those people. When I listened to it 20 years ago, when I was already an indie kid, I immediately thought, what do the critics don't? what's not to get here. This is a fantastic masterpiece, and some people called it even like the birth of indie rock, in a way, alternative rock. And yeah, I mean, Velvet Underground and Equal was kind of the birth of a different angle of indie rock, and there are more albums than this that can claim that, but this is one of those albums that I think are very influential to a more lo-fi indie aesthetic in a way, and the songs are brilliant on this album. You know, Paul, you know, this was the time when he was really angry at the world and then the other Beatles, and Paul McCartney usually isn't known for being angry, but the few times he was angry or where he was with his back against the wall, usually that produces his best work. You know, he needs this kind of negative pressure to kind of minimize the more sappy, soppy, corny side of him. But these are still also lots of corny moments, and us Paul McCartney fans, we also love those corny moments, but it is also passion and anger, and therefore it's one of the most complete Paul McCartney solo albums. Next one is number 25. Wow, top 25. And it has to be a very iconic album to, you know, ring in the top 25. It's London Calling by The Clash. I struggle to call this a punk album because this transcends punk and it's so much more than that. But if we call it a punk album, this is one of the at least two best punk albums of all time. You will see what I mean in a moment. But yeah, this is more than a punk album, and this is really a band, a great band reaching its creative climax here and experimenting with all sorts of stuff, but still being very true to who they are in a way. You know, it's not like they're selling out on this album, it's just that they expand in a very exciting way. But I just told you it's probably only one of the two best punk albums of all time, if we call it a punk album. And the best pure punk album of all time has to be, you know, there's no debate about this. Never mind the Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. This is all that punk always was supposed to be about, you know. Green Day, Offspring, those bands, they are not what punk is about or should be about. They are sellouts, you know. But this is what Malcolm McLaren and Johnny Rotten, aka John Lydon, and what they envisioned. You know, Malcolm and John, they hated each other, but you know, in a way they needed each other, because Malcolm was like 50% of what, well, let's say Malcolm was like 33 and a third percent of what punk is supposed to be, the vision of it. John was the other 33%, and Steve Jones and Paul Cook and Glenn Matlock, because this was before Sid Vicious. This album was conceived with Glenn Matlock. They are the third. You know, they give the sound, the compositional structure and sound. Glenn, Steve, and Paul. But the creative vision, the artistic vision, that's 50% Malcolm, 50% John. They didn't like each other, but they needed each other to, you know, for this to come out, and this is rightfully so one of the big moments in rock history and the biggest moment in punk rock history. Number 23 is maybe the last tie. I don't think there will be a tie in the top 20. And because it's Sgt. Pepper and it's tied with Magical Mystery Tour. I can show it. Here's the EP. That's the real EP of how it was conceived. But of course, in 1968, Magical Mystery Tour came out as an album version, which was the American version of Magical Mystery Tour. It's the only case where the American version of a Beatle album got canonized by Apple as the real version. And if we say that Magical Mystery is a proper Beatle album and not just a double EP, then it's at least as good as Sgt. Pepper. And personally, I'm tempted to listen more often to Magical Mystery Tour, the album, than to Sgt. Pepper. So I prefer even Magical Mystery Tour. But it's a tie, and I think, you know, the album I'm really showing here as my number 23 is Sgt. Pepper, because of course this was conceived as an album and not like Magical Mystery Tour is like a half an album, and they're both about the same, you know, that's the same era of the Beatles, and this is of course an iconic, the iconic album. If you're talking about the 100 most iconic albums of all time, this could be number one. It's not the best Beatle album. I think Paul McCartney still to this day believes this is the best Beatle album. Of course, many other people I think will also think like that, but I think the other three Beatles never would have agreed with that, and I also would have never agreed with it. But for what it is, that maybe one of the first real concept albums and rock operas in a way, and an album that really tried to be more about the identity of the whole, the sum of the parts. This has to be my number 23, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Number 22 is also from that psychedelic late 60s era in Britain, although the musician, the guy we're talking about is American, but he started his career in England with English people, in the band and management. It's Jimi Hendrix. This Jimi Hendrix Experience, Electric Ladyland. It's not the original cover because I think Jimi didn't like the original cover. I also don't think that this would have been his version of the cover, but this is of course all the versions after he passed are basically, or most of the versions of this cover. So there's a couple of covers, for this album, but this is in recent decades. This is like the compromise cover. Electric Ladyland, double album, one of the best psychedelic rock albums, maybe my favorite. I'm not sure if in the top 20 we'll have more of those kind of genre. Probably my favorite psychedelic blues rock albums of all time, and Jimi Hendrix's best album, also his most colorful, eclectic, also his most pop moments in a way on this album. And I prefer it to Are You Experienced, which didn't even make my top 100, although it's a great album, of course. And the last one for today, 21. 21 is my lucky number, so it has to be a special album, of course. It's Histoire de Melody Nelson by Serge Gainsbourg, my favorite French album of all time, with Jane Birkin, lead vocals. The vocals are shared by Serge and Jane Birkin, who had this, Serge's biggest hit, Je t'aime non plus, came out 1 or 2 years before that. That was also a duet of Serge and Jane, of course, but this is the great album after the novelty hit. This is not a novelty album. This is an eerie, fantastic odyssey of an album. It's a bit like an erotic version of the Dark Side of the Moon. This is if a sex maniac from France made his own version of Dark Side of the Moon, and it's the arrangements, the string arrangements, so influential and so fantastic sounding, and this is also one of those beginning to end albums that you have to really listen to from track 1 to the last track. It doesn't really make sense to pick out a couple of tracks, although the song Ballad, the Melody Nelson, is probably also works as a single track, and I prefer it to Je t'aime non plus, for example. At least the Jane Birkin, Serge Gainsbourg version, The Brigitte Bardot version of Je t'aime is a different kettle of fish that I would prefer even to anything on this album. But we're talking about this album, and as an album, this is his strongest album and my favorite French album of all time. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time with the top 20. Goodbye.